Hi, Scott Cox here with Interface Coaching. Do a screen recording to get into our time trialer phenotype. This is another common phenotype. We did sprinter last time. Time trialists are pretty common phenotype for bike racers, coming from other endurance sports, triathlon, long distance running, those type things. And so we see here their strengths are out here in the 5 minute and longer, so VO2 max and threshold, in relation to sprint power and anaerobic capacity. But we can notice with this athlete that they're quite good here too. So it would be pretty easy to maybe turn them into an all-rounder. And by doing so, maybe they improve this area over here, and then maybe their threshold drops. So again, maybe that's not something that they want to do. I bring that up because I see a lot of athletes, they're trying to improve threshold and they don't have much time, so they're doing this high intensity training, which has a pretty high strain in the anaerobic system. Or even if you're doing threshold intervals and you're just trying to get your maximal power, you might be training your anaerobic system more than you want to. So you're doing 2x20s, but your 1 minute power is increasing and your threshold's not changing. And I think the key to improvement out here, developing these areas, is riding under threshold. So make sure you get your threshold estimated correctly so that you're not training too hard. I see it over and over. Athletes are training too hard. Quickly with this athlete, that's what I saw when we first started working together. We do not do much high intensity at all, and what we're seeing is sprints improving, anaerobic ability holding steady, and we're seeing nice gains out here. And it's a lot of low intensity training. And of course this athlete's talented, but they're doing the work on and off the bike. But the intensity of the training is actually probably quite a bit lower than some people might think. We can look at their power duration curve here and anaerobic contribution, and we see some metrics. 1500 watt sprint, FTP is 375 watts, VO2 max is 72. They can ride above threshold quite a bit. They're 168 pounds, so a bigger cyclist, but not big by any means, in my opinion, and pretty good across the board. So this athlete could win field sprints, and you see that if you watch the Tour de France. I think it was last year, right? With some of the sprinters were having trouble and the races were hard, and you're seeing the lead out guy and cyclocross world champions and kind of time trialist types, winning field sprints. And so just because you're a time trialer doesn't mean you can't sprint. And this high threshold, it's not everything, but it's definitely helpful. The other thing is, this is a master's athlete. This is an athlete that's over 50 years old. 1500 watt sprint, so quite good here. I think that if you read a lot of things, it's right. We're losing VO2 max, we're losing sprint power. Getting old, everything's declining. But this probably resonates with me because I am aging. I guess I'm 46 now. But I hope this shows that this is quite human. This is legit. This is a person just doing the right things. There's several masters athletes with this kind of ability that I race against around the country. They're clean. This is very human. And so bike racing's hard, man. But anyway, even as we get older, we can just keep getting better and better. What I wanted to get into a little bit is the sprint, because threshold, and this is an athlete with a high threshold, and hopefully this will clear some things up there about, should you improve your threshold or whatnot. So sprint power is a combination of your threshold, your aerobic contribution, your anaerobic contribution, depending how strong that system is, and then you're going to get 400 to 600 watts from your creatine phosphate system. And this is going to, if we add these up, right, that's going to give us this 1500 watt sprint. Why I wanted to go over that is when you're riding above threshold at the end of the race into the sprint, you're draining this system. So at the end of a race, if you had to go over threshold for even a minute or so into the sprint, you're going to lose quite a bit of your sprint power because this is being drained. So, but if you're under threshold, you're maintaining this. So again, not that threshold is everything, but if you have a high threshold, you're probably going to maintain a lot of the sprint at the end of the race because you're not, you don't have to ride over threshold going into the sprint. Because usually the last 4 minutes into a sprint is going to be pretty hard. And this athlete will probably be under threshold in amateur races. So they're probably going to be able to put out a really good sprint. Whereas if, for a sprinter, a lot of times they're riding over threshold, going into the end of the race. And then, they're they're being drained big time here. So they're losing a lot of power in their sprint, and that's why you want to keep that anaerobic ability here. You want this as high as possible because that's not going to be impacted. So that's going to help your sprint. So anyway, hopefully that clears a few things up there. Maybe it complicates things, but there's some things I think there will help you if you break it down. So quickly reviewing the athlete, fiber types, what's recruited at different intensities of VO2 max, so we can see that. And then let's get into some workouts for our time trialist. And remember, we did the long, slow ride, tempo, muscle tension intervals, SFRs, torque, sweet spot, FTP. We've got our 30-15s. We got steady state VO2 max intervals. And we can dive into those a little bit using the anaerobic contribution. So again, as this athlete, if they're going to go out for a long, slow, a 4-hour ride, 200 watts, right? I think that's enough. This athlete could ride at 225 watts or 250 watts for their base rides, but I don't think you need to. And I think an athlete can ride at a lower intensity out here and get more gains. And I harp on this because I see athletes with a 300 watt FTP that are trying to ride at 200 and 225 watts, and they're just making themselves more tired. So here's an athlete with a very high FTP that does long rides at 200 watts, and what we keep seeing is in gains here and here. I believe that's a big part of it. If we start to get into tempo for this athlete, we're going to be out in this area here, so 300 watts. I think it's largely aerobic. There's not much anaerobic contribution, but remember, now we're starting to get into this area here, and we're recruiting these type 2A fibers and potentially training them aerobically. And, for our time trialer, that might hurt the sprint, but I think for the time trialer, I might consider that, because if their threshold's high, right, they can probably get to the end of the race in clean wheels, or they're going to be in a breakaway with other strong riders. Now they just need to be the best sprinter in that reduced group. So losing some sprint power maybe isn't a big deal for them. So the time trialer, I might consider tempo work because their threshold's high. So we're trying to get that threshold higher and higher. So their sprint's good enough. So that'd be something I would consider an area to really train a lot in. I actually might do a lot of this if I was a time trialer, because that's where we clear a lot of lactate. And a lot of athletes want to ride at threshold. And there's a lot of fatigue that comes with that. And, because there is some anaerobic contribution there. And, but if we think about maybe getting out into, sweet spot and tempo, for your time trialists, those might be some really good areas to train at that don't cause a lot of fatigue and teach your body to clear lactate. When you're manipulating these fibers, that'd be an area that I'd really look at if I'm trying to, improve here and here. I think those intensities work quite well for the time trialist. Looking at some other examples here, we got the big gear work. We talked about sweet spot, tempo there, or FTP there. So let's look at our big gear work. It's going to fall in the tempo power, and so we're probably out in here area 300 watts. Again, now if we're doing that work, we're really recruiting these fibers here because we're doing that lower cadence, and that might help with some aerobic abilities, and maybe it hurts the sprint. But again, for our athlete here, they're pretty good. So for your time trialer that's trying to improve this big gear work at tempo power might be something to really look at. And so that would be another workout that I think would make sense. Remember, it didn't make a lot of sense for a sprinter trying to keep their sprint, but for the time trialer, maybe there's some really good gains there to be had at the lower intensities. Let's see here. Let's get into our 30-15s and VO2 max and steady state. So with that, remember, for our 30-15s, we're probably going to target 4-minute power. And for this time trialer athlete, that's 81% aerobic, 18% anaerobic. So, it's under that 20-25% anaerobic. So they're probably not going to improve their anaerobic abilities a whole lot. So the 30-15s, again, for a time trialer, maybe they make some sense to do there. So we can improve that anaerobic ability a little bit, and maybe that will help them in races. So 30-15s for the time trialer would be something I'd reach for, maybe a little bit more for general training. Whereas, remember with our sprinter, with the high anaerobic ability, maybe we weren't going to do that as much. So the 30-15s make some sense. If we were going to do, longer intervals for this athlete, so probably 5 minutes. So again, we're looking for 85% aerobic and not some anaerobic. So the steady state intervals there, they make some sense. For our time trialer, maybe 5-minute intervals are the ticket. Remember, the sprinter was doing 8-minute intervals for VO2 max potentially, or even lower power. The stronger the aerobic ability is, maybe the shorter the intervals would be. If we look at our 4x10s, right? So 4x10 FTP, now it's 90% aerobic, 8% anaerobic. I think you remember for the sprinter, that was, I think about 83% aerobic. I can't remember exactly, but it was quite a bit lower. So remember, the sprinter was going to do, 30-minute intervals maybe, but our time trialer, maybe those 10-minute intervals make sense. So, we have to dive into things a little bit deeper as far as anaerobic ability, and there's things to look at. But in general, I think for time trialists, there's a lot of gains to be had in the tempo and sweet spot, and then even shorter intervals, so the 5 to 10 minute area, and then also some 30-15s. Those make some good sense to do that. As far as other training, overgeared starts, so some power there, and these all-out 20 to 60 second efforts. Well, let's look at it. So I think for an athlete, the overgeared starts to improve some power, and that translates into the bike. I think I would do that for most athletes because it's similar forces to the weight room. So I think, if we can increase that raw power a little bit, then that's going to probably increase power across the board. So I would do some of that. As far as 20-second intervals, would I do that for this athlete? Again, it's highly anaerobic and not much aerobic. For the time trialer, I'd probably, the sprinter, I might do 20 seconds. The time trialer, I'm probably going to head out here more to a minute. It's 50-50. Big reason for that is we generally aren't going to improve power a lot here in the shorter durations, and we can extend power out longer. My experience with time trialers is they tend to respond better to 1-minute intervals. We start to get into anaerobic work. We have to figure out which each athlete benefits from, but in general, I might lean towards 1 minute versus 20 seconds. So say the time trialer doesn't have the power, right? Remember the last examples we talked about, these shorter intervals, we're trying to find more power. So we're doing a hard effort with really long rest in between and complete recoveries. I think for your time trialer type, you're probably better served to go 1 minute versus maybe 20 to 30 seconds. Let's see here. Lowered carb training. I would consider that for the time trialer because their strengths are aerobic, and they want to get to the race at the end of the race with as much energy as possible and some clean wheels or in a smaller group. So that would maybe help with threshold and fat burning. So I think that some lowered carb training is something I would consider for the time trialer type. Weight training. I think it's good for all cyclists. The time trialer can probably get away without it because they're not trying to preserve that sprint. And then maybe doing some of this overgeared work that does create similar forces to the weight room. So maybe they could do something like that and spend time there. So like I say, I think just for general health and performance on the bike, I am a believer in weight training, but the time trialer probably can get away without it. I would definitely do some core work. I think for any of us, keeping your core strong is going to help prevent injury and transfer power to the bike. Typical training week. Remember, this was our sprinter. I haven't changed this, but I'd be looking at, for a time trialist. I think you could do a lot more work. So maybe it's 4 days in a row of, in tempo, so endurance and tempo. So instead of maybe doing these, lower intensity rides, right? So instead of maybe doing all the riding out here at this 200 watts, maybe the time trialer could, blend in some tempo and some zone 3 because now you're getting to this area. But you're wanting to change these fibers more this way because it makes sense for you. So hopefully that gives you some tips and some help as a time trialer. And then there's hopefully as a sprinter, you have some ideas on maybe why you wouldn't want to try to improve your threshold versus your anaerobic capacity. So anyway, hope that helps, and good luck.